Hey, shalom, guys. Welcome to my channel. My name is Will Walkie. Today, we're going to be doing another book review for you guys today. Today, we'll be specifically looking at Wisdom Christology in the Gospel of John here. This is an absolute amazing book, and this is by Dr. Dustin Smith, and I'm going to bring him up, so please help me welcome Dr. Dustin Smith. Brother man, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, it's good to be on again. How you doing, Will?
Yes. Yes, if anyone, please, before you watch this video, go back. I have an interview with Dr. Dustin Smith where we just kind of go over him, how he got started. We talk about kind of the Trinity, the whole Nicaea thing before and after. And we go over the Trinity's verses, right? John 1:1, John 8:58, John 10:30. So, brought you back again. You have sent me this book a few months ago, this Wisdom Christology book. And let me first say this to my audience here. I'm about to expose Dr. Dustin Smith. Are you ready? You ready for this exposure? I'm going to expose you, Dr. Dustin Smith, because when you guys read the title, it says Wisdom Christology in the Gospel of John. You hear in that title, you're going to be hoodwinked, you're going to be bamboozled, because not only does he go over the Gospel of John, he goes over the entire Tanakh. He goes over the entire New Testament. And to all my Catholic and Orthodox friends out there, Dr. Dustin Smith did not forget about you, because he goes over the Apocrypha also. He looks at all of Wisdom Christology all throughout, not just the 66 book canon, but everything that Christians consider canonical. This is Dr. Dustin Smith, man. This took me a while to read, because not only was I trying to read it, I was trying to look at all of the references that you bring up in this book. And I mean, seriously, this book is fantastic. Seriously.
You're very kind. I appreciate that.
And I feel like when I do these book reviews, if this book sucked, Dustin, I would have sent it back to you and I just said, hey, I don't like this. And I feel like within the realm of Christianity, there's so many commentaries out there. There's so many biblical ones that talk about Christology, the Christophany, typology with type, anti-type, and type, commentaries on the New Testament, Old Testament. I just feel like a lot of them suck. So I feel like when people want to get a good understanding of what they're reading, finding certain books are really hard to find. Do you feel like you also have that problem?
I'm very selective, and it takes a certain type of writer that does really, really good research, but also is able to take all of that data and to write it in a way that I think an average reader can digest. And it's not easy to do, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that, but it's so few and far between that whenever you find those books, you remember them and you're quite ready and willing to recommend them to other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I want to make myself big real quick. How do I do that? There we go. So I just wanted to show you guys just a little taste of what we'll kind of be doing. So as you can see from the very top, that's obviously what Justin has written. And then these are all the notes and the sources where he gets his material. So Dr. Dustin Smith here is not pulling this out of the wind or anything like that. He has taken the time. He has done his due diligence research, which I appreciate. And especially to have all these sources here to basically show support of your belief, where you're getting these from. I mean, it's important, right? Because even though people have doctorate degrees, a lot of them are opinion dogmatically based, where it seems when I see all these citations from different biblical authors, it's like you've really done your research. And when you guys get this book, I mean, it's all over. I was so impressed where just the amount of time that not only you writing this book, but to even study the topic is just mind blowing to me. So seriously,
yeah, and I think there's a lot of people out there today that they have some idea that they want to convey to other people, or they have some sort of belief or whatever it may be. And others are saying, okay, well, I'm willing to be persuaded. I'm willing to listen, but there's not a lot to back it up. There's not a lot of data. There's not a really persuasive argument that's given. And so I felt that, hey, anyone can write a book these days. I think something like 4,000 books are published every single day in the world. So, books are a dime a dozen. How do I take this idea that I actually think is very important for understanding the Gospel of John? How do I write it in a way and convince people that this is something that actually is worth reading and something that's going to be beneficial to you in your ability to understand the Gospel of John? And the best way to do that is to show your research, to show your citations, and to show where other experts that are way smarter than I am have been saying this for over 100 years. So I didn't make any of this up. I'm really just kind of standing on the shoulders of lots of other smart people.
Well, I mean, seriously, I feel like any type of wisdom Christology, at all, talking about Sophia, I feel like, seriously, this is, guys, the new standard. Anyone who is getting any type of master's, PhD in theology or philosophy regarding the Bible, this is a must read. I feel like if you don't read this, then your degree means nothing, and you have to get this under your belt. We really do. But I want to go to real quick, Amazon, guys. This is where you can go and get it. So, Wisdom Christology in the Gospel of John, right here, 4.9. Don't worry, Dustin. We're gonna find who gave you anything but a 5, and I'll have a talk with them. Make that 5 out of 5. 46 ratings though. This is what you guys got to do. Just go to Amazon, Wisdom Christology and the Gospel of John, right there.
And 46 is actually pretty good for a book only being out 6 months. That's I would say that's fairly well reviewed for a book that just came out this year. So, and to me, it's like when I ask people to give me a review, I tell them, I say, hey, just be honest. I said, if you thought it was terrible, tell me. Like, if you think there's something that wasn't very, very good to my argument, or that it didn't make any sense to you, just be honest with me. Like, tell me what I could do better. I'm not perfect, and I've learned a lot from it, and I've had lots of conversations with people that read it, and I'm going to be better the next time that I do it. So I'm just happy that people are reading it and they're finding it beneficial.
I just love this. Although I do think that perhaps the author has overstated his case a bit. This book is nonetheless a very worthwhile read. I love that. A compelling explanation of wisdom Christology, a must read for understanding John's gospel, a fresh and compelling perspective on wisdom, literature, and the scriptures. I mean, so many positive things have been said regarding this book. I'll say this though. Anyone who is serious about the Bible, you need to get this. It doesn't have to just be for a PhD or a master's. I was just joking earlier, but if anyone is serious about really understanding agency, the Christophany that we see, even where the New Testament authors drew comparisons to, especially in Second Temple Judaism, which you talk a lot on. And, me, someone who dabbles with Torah and Messianic Judaism, I really appreciated getting to those parts and reading. Yeah. So, but I want to dive in a little bit. Got some questions for you regarding this book. And I'm hoping everyone watching and listening would help be inspired and moved to, at the end of this book interview, to please go out and get this. Like, this is absolutely fantastic. Seriously. So let's go into, so how long have you been studying this topic? Just because I know I mentioned a little earlier of all the citations, all different books that you've had to read. I mean, how long did that all take?
Yeah, I kind of feel like as soon as anyone becomes convinced that God is only one person, that Jesus is the Son of God, the most common response verse is, well, have you ever read John 1:1? And so you're constantly thinking, okay, how can I take this passage and how can I explain it to people to get people to realize that it doesn't mean what I think they're being told that it means. And so as I read through various commentaries on the Gospel of John, I start to notice that they say, okay, in the beginning was the Word, and there are parallels with all of this Jewish wisdom literature. And I thought that's really interesting because it's not in my typical Protestant canon. My Protestant canon is the 66 book canon. And so I've been familiarizing myself with this, I would say, for a little bit over 20 years. And, I've been reading up on it off and on, and kind of like, you put things in the back of your mind. You're like, okay, that's interesting. And it just kind of sits there on the back burner. And at some point I was just like, okay, it's just like this fire in my belt. I got to get this out. I got to say something. I got to do something. I feel like there's enough information that I have that I think I can organize and I can actually put into a book form. And I think I can write it in a way that will be accessible to motivated laypersons. I would actually say that, by the way, that if you would define yourself as a layperson that is motivated, then you're going to find this book accessible. It's not, I would say, an easy read, but it's one that I think you will be able to chew through if you would find yourself, or at least define yourself as someone that's motivated. So I started writing it maybe 3 years ago. It's taken a long time to do this. Of course, it's been out for 6 months, and the post-production aspect of it takes a little bit longer too. But yeah, I would say quite a long time I've been thinking about this topic. I didn't just wake up one day and say, let's just go to the keyboard and start typing this out, and boom, it's done. It's been a long time coming.
Okay, now with writing this book, do you think that you were like fulfilling a need that wasn't there within the realms of Christianity, or was it there but it wasn't like as good, so you were kind of like expounding upon it? You wanted to like not reinventing the wheel, but there's a crappy wheel and you're here to make them fantastic model of it.
Yeah, so if you were to go to Google or go to even Amazon, you type in Wisdom Christology in the Gospel of John or Wisdom Christology in the Fourth Gospel, you're not really going to turn up anything, at least not something that's accessible to average readers. I think someone back in like 1992 wrote their doctoral dissertation on it, but that's not something that's accessible to people. I read through it because I just wanted to be well read on the particular topic. And of course, I was influenced by a lot of what that person said, even though I actually take things in a different direction on some pretty important points. But my argument in this book, we probably should just say this, is that I actually think that the major Christological portrayal in the fourth gospel, in the Gospel of John, is wisdom Christology. And wisdom Christology is the Christological portrayal of the person Jesus Christ that takes the roles, attributes, characteristics of personified wisdom and applies them to Jesus. And while it's fairly common for commentators to say, well, there's wisdom Christology in the prologue of John's gospel, that's John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18, I actually think there's a very compelling case to say that there's wisdom Christology in all 21 chapters of the Gospel of John, not just because the prologue functions as the intentional introduction to the rest of the gospel. It's not just like a cover that's slapped on to the rest of it. It intends to introduce the topics so that if it's there in the prologue, you should also expect it there as well. And there just really isn't, despite all of the scholarly work that's put into the Gospel of John, there isn't a single volume that is completely dedicated to exploring the wisdom Christology. And so I felt that I was providing something that wasn't already there, which is actually hard to do with the Gospel of John because nearly everything that could be said on it has already been said in some way.
Oh, right. Yeah, I know. I hear so many times from Christians of new people coming in. Where do I start? Everyone tells them starting the Gospel of John.
I would not say that. I think the Gospel of John is the most sophisticated and requires far more background in order to fully make sense of it. I actually think it's the most difficult of the four Gospels. So I'm not trying to shoot myself in the foot here. I'm just saying that is not the place that I would start. Just start with Matthew,
No, right. Well, I mean, I think at the same time too, when a dad gets his 16-year-old daughter or son a car, he doesn't buy the most expensive thing on the lot, right? He gets a crappy car and he works up to it. And I mean, right here, this is like a Mercedes, where you're not going to necessarily hand this to someone without even reading the Gospel of John first or even being familiar with it. This is more for like a serious Bible student. So like that makes sense. So we're saying Christology a lot. So let's kind of define it. So like, what is Christology and how is wisdom Christology related to Jesus? I know you mentioned a little bit, or Jesus. I know you mentioned a little bit of it, but if you can also expound upon it.
Yeah, so Christology basically is just the study of Christ, and Christ, of course, is the Greek word Christos, which means the anointed king. It's the Greek word that shows up in the Septuagint that translates Mashiach, particularly like in Psalm 2 and a variety of other places. So Christ just means the Messiah. Messiah means Christ, just means the anointed king. It, of course, is not Jesus' last name. I work on a college campus, and I definitely had to give a Bible study last night and convince people that Jesus Christ, that's not his first and last name, as if he is the son of Mary and Joseph Christ. So it's a title. It means king, king of the kingdom of God. Sometimes in the New Testament, you will actually see even it reversed. You'll see it as Christ Jesus, like the emphasis there being King Jesus. So Jesus Christ just means Jesus, the anointed king of God's kingdom. So again, just Christology is a study of Jesus, and it could be a variety of things, but typically it has to do with his person, pre-existence, his sacrificial work, what he did in his ministry. So really anything about Jesus. And it's a big subject because Jesus is the most controversial figure, I would say, in the last 2,000 years, without question. It divides churches, it divides denominations, it's caused a variety of excommunication, and lots and lots and lots of words have been written on it. I have an entire shelf back there that's just Christology. There's just so much that's being written on it. So it's a big deal. So that's just, and there's a lot of different types of Christology. There's Adam Christology, which is how Jesus is functioning as a type of the first human being, Adam. There's Son of God Christology. There's Son of Man Christology. There's Suffering Servant Christology. So again, wisdom Christology is the portrayal of Jesus, the portrayal of the person of Christ that takes the various descriptions, roles, attributes, characteristics formerly belonging to God's wisdom. And I labor in the book to make the strongest case I possibly can to demonstrate that that figure of wisdom in Second Temple Judaism was a personification. It's the personification of God's wise interaction with the world, but also his wise instructions to his creation. And these writers, at least the early Christians, were saying, okay, Jesus is the climax of God's wisdom. But what the interesting thing is that they were not the first people to say that. There were actually 3 Jewish writers prior to the early Christians that were already saying that we can pinpoint certain figures that also are the embodiment of God's wisdom. So this raises questions about the nature of preexistence and all sorts of other things, like how indebted the gospel writers are to Judaism. So I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about with that.
Mm-hmm. No, right. Yeah. So the next thing I want to look at is, I feel like this is probably one of the most common things when people hear like wisdom Christology, right? Christ ology, study of Christ, and you hear wisdom. I feel like if you go into a church long enough, you will definitely hear a pastor talk about Proverbs 8, specifically chapter 8, verse 22 to 30 of wisdom personified. You know, I was with him in the very beginning, before the earth was, I was standing next to him. You know, I feel like a lot of people are familiar with that. And they will relate that to a pre-existent Jesus. But I want to ask you, what did the early church fathers say regarding this versus how did the Jews understand Proverbs 8?
Yeah, so they went in 2 different directions. So the early church fathers very quickly started to misunderstand the function of personification. And of course, they started to see that that was actually a conscious pre-existent figure. Now, they don't read it very carefully because wisdom is a female person. And, you know, if you follow the logic there, you would have to say that Jesus would not be the pre-existent son. He would have to be the pre-existent daughter. Now, they never say that, but if you kind of follow the train of thought, that's where they actually should land. They don't actually do that. Jews, on the other hand, they knew that wisdom was a personification, and we can see this by the way that they discuss it in the intertestamental books. They wouldn't call them that. Things like Sirach and Baruch and Wisdom of Solomon. In the Jewish Targums, we'll talk about this a little bit more, Targum Neophiti, and we can also see it in the Dead Sea Scrolls where they talk about God's wisdom. So Jews understood that. They're very, very familiar that God often has his attributes being personified. God sends forth his word. God sends forth his spirit. God sends forth his wisdom. And this is just another way of saying that this is a God that is deeply interested in his creation, and he's involving himself in creation. He's not some sort of absentee God or absentee landlord. He deeply cares and is concerned about his creation. So the early Christians basically, to kind of sum it all up, they took it as a conscious pre-existent figure. There are some Christians in the 4th century, this is a little weird, they would actually read the passage in Proverbs 8 in regard to the actual ministry of Jesus, which is kind of strange. It's not like the pre-existence of Jesus. They would actually say, no, it's the actual ministry of Jesus that we read about in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So, but I can tell you this, that biblical scholars, there is a consensus at this point. They all acknowledge, whether they're liberal or conservative, left-leaning, right-leaning, that the figure of wisdom in the book of Proverbs is a personification, not a conscious person. That is just stated in all the commentaries on Proverbs that you're going to see over the last 25 years. So, and I'm very, very good at documenting that, to point that out to people, because I know that's not a very popular way of reading it. But unfortunately, these people that are making those arguments kind of in the popular circles are not well informed of what scholars are saying and the reasons why the scholars are saying that.
Okay, no, yeah, that makes sense. I appreciate that. Next, I want to look at where in the Old Testament do New Testament writers reference wisdom, either in the Masoretic or the Septuagint?
Yeah, so in the Old Testament, you're going to find the figure of wisdom in basically 3 places. Well, I guess you could say like 4, but so Proverbs, of course, is the biggest one. Okay, Proverbs 1-9 and Proverbs 31 were the most impactful. Psalm 104 verse 24 is also really important because it says, "Oh Yahweh, how great are your works! With wisdom you made them all." Okay, so Yahweh is the creator, but Yahweh uses his wisdom to create all things. And so we can see that wisdom there is this agent of God being the creator. It doesn't say that wisdom is the creator. It's just that God uses his wisdom in order to create all things. But it's also there, that same thing in Proverbs 3:19, where Yahweh by wisdom created the heavens and the earth. And so you can see it in Psalms, you can see it in Proverbs. It's also there in Jeremiah in a couple passages. So it's not just in the poetic literature. You can also see it there in the prophetic literature as well. Job 28 has a very interesting poem about wisdom, about how wisdom is something that we should seek. It's inaccessible. It's hard to find. Who can find her? And then it kind of concludes by saying, well, if you have the fear of Yahweh, the fear of the Lord, then you're going to be able to find access to God's wisdom. But Proverbs is definitely the most influential passage when it comes to seeing the impact of wisdom on all the subsequent writers. And of course, as I've already mentioned, between the writings of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament, we have all these intertestamental writers, not just the intertestamental books, but you have the Dead Sea Scrolls and you have Philo of Alexandria, which you might talk about as well. And all these writers, all these Jewish writers in their own way, and also even in their own languages. It's not just something that was there in Hebrew. 1Q20 is a really important passage for talking about God's wisdom in the Dead Sea Scrolls that's written in Aramaic. And then Philo, of course, is writing in Greek. So you have basically all 3 of the biblical languages that demonstrate the impact of God's wisdom being embodied into a particularly wise human individual, whether that individual is male or female. So most of the New Testament writers are going to be reading out of the Septuagint because Greek is just the common language, the lingua franca. 70% of the quotations in the New Testament of the Old Testament are from the Septuagint, but some of them can read Hebrew. So There's that sort of impact as well. There's an interesting passage in Proverbs 8 where it says, Yahweh, either Yahweh created me or Yahweh acquired me, because the verb is actually ambiguous in Hebrew. And so the Greek translator has to say, well, I have to pick one of these. Is it God, that God created it or God acquired it? And so he has to pick one of those. And so he actually goes with created. And so that is one of the ways in which this gets unpacked. Not every Jewish writer understands it that way, but that's just kind of the limitations of Greek based on some of the nuances of Hebrew. And hopefully I'm not talking over everyone's head by talking about some of these languages. But as they sometimes say, the devil's in the details. And I want to make these details available and accessible to people. And so hopefully people will find that to be true when they read through the book for themselves.
No, so it's kind of funny because you mentioned, like, I feel like one of the biggest arguments that I will argue with Trinitarians, because when they say that, before I say this, I feel like people miss the point of symbolic language. Like for us, when we talk about like Mother Earth, Earth is not a literal mother. Or if someone is not doing something correct and I tell them to use your head, right? What I mean by that is, like, think about what, to do. So let's say someone's hammering something. I'm like, use your head. When they start using their head as a hammer, that's not what I meant. So it's funny because when people say that God used his wisdom, I feel like it's how you said in Psalms 104, whatever. To me, how I read that is God was using his attribute. Like God used his strength to lift a rock.
Yeah.
Right. Not that God is sitting here commanding someone named Strength to go and lift the rock, and there's some divine agent to represent Yahweh. But it's so funny that people will do this. Now, going back to what I was going to say, is people will then associate that Jesus is the wisdom that is mentioned in Proverbs 8. But it's interesting because with Trinitarian theology, and I know you know this, Jesus is eternal, right?
Yeah.
No beginning, no end.
Yeah.
But it literally, different translations, whether the Septuagint or the Hebrew, will use language as set up, brought forth, established, generated, and even created, which are all synonyms for created. So that's like one of the biggest arguments then for people, I feel like you and me and other people who believe in just one God. And we'll say that if this was Jesus, let's say that this literally is Jesus himself, well, him being created, set up, established, brought forth, whatever, diminishes even the idea that he's eternal.
Yeah. And the Arian believers will say, sure, okay, we'll work with that. They'll still say we got pre-existence there and that Jesus is the firstborn of all creation. So, I mean, that doesn't stop them. But I think the problem with both of those is that they've not taken seriously the fact that wisdom is a personification. Okay. And there's a big difference between a personification and a conscious female person. And again, if you're going to take it as literal preexistence, you have to say that Jesus preexisted as a female person. Okay. They don't want to do that because it gives away the whole game. But again, scholars are saying it's a personification. When you read through the literature and you take seriously the literature that's there and how God constantly is personifying his attributes. I mean, God sends forth his burning anger. He sends that forth. Okay. We don't take that literally. It's just, this is what God does. God interacts by sending forth his personified attributes. That's just how he functions. And, apart from prose, poetry is the second most dominant type of literature in the Hebrew Bible. And we have to learn how to interpret poetry on its own terms, very, very carefully. And your default setting can't be, I'm going to read it literally until it doesn't make sense literally to me, and then I'm going to read it figuratively. That's not how you're taught in hermeneutics textbooks to interpret Proverbs or Psalms or any other poetic literature. So we got to, I'm not saying that you have to just read it however you want. We got to take it seriously. You got to take it on its own terms. And of course, you can't get to Proverbs 8 until you read Proverbs 1 through 7. And it's very clear that Proverbs introduces wisdom in the opening 3, 4, 5 verses as just a synonym for God's instruction, God's words, God's commandments. And so the reader of Proverbs, primarily males at the time in which it was written, would understand that to accept and to seek after God's wisdom, that would mean to seek after God's laws, God's Torah, the commandments of Moses, because they are wise instructions. Well, here's the literary strategy. How do you convince young men to seek after God's wisdom? You personify it as a female, and you say, hey, boys, come after me, come seek after me, come listen to me, because that's how you get them. And that's part of the literary strategy of Proverbs. And you see that personification in chapter 1, in chapter 3, in chapter 8, and in chapter 9. And they function differently, because Proverbs chapter 1 is a prophetess, okay? Proverbs chapter 3 is also kind of a prophetic figure, but also she kind of serves as a tree of life. Proverbs chapter 8, she's this child almost. And in Proverbs chapter 9, she's a homeowner. And, these are just various ways in which these sages, these wise sages, are trying to convince the readers through poetry to actually take hold of God's laws, God's wise commandments. And so the early Christians were saying, if you're interested in God's laws, they're ultimately going to be embodied in Jesus. I mean, Jesus is the climax of God's wisdom. And, eventually we're going to get to talking about this, but the early Christians were not the first people to say this. It's already there in Proverbs chapter 31. It's already there in Sirach, and it's already there in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's already there in Philo for any of the early Christians were even talking. So they're just continuing this Jewish theological portrayal of taking personified wisdom and applying them to actual human beings without saying that these human beings are 100% God, 100% man, or 100% wisdom, 100% man, or that they have a conscious preexistence. None of them were saying that. None of them meant that. They were just saying that if you're interested in God's wisdom, you're now going to find it climactically and definitively in the man Jesus Christ.
So just to hear this again from you. So Dr. Dustin Smith, you're suggesting to people to, if they want to understand wisdom, to start in chapter 1 and read the whole thing in sequence instead of just jumping to chapter 8, right?
I think if you're reading any biblical book, you should not start in the middle of it. Okay. How many of you, if you're going to go to a movie that starts at 2:00, say, okay, at 3:15, I'm going to walk in the door and I'm going to enjoy this. You're going to walk into the middle and you're like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know who the main characters are. I don't know who the antagonists are. I don't know the story. Like, why would you do that? Start with chapter 1, verse 1, and just work your way through slowly, carefully, paying attention to what's going on there. And you don't want to proof text things. You don't want to grab things out of context. And the context, of course, of chapter 8 is everything that's already been said in the first 7 chapters. I can't believe we have to even have this conversation.
No, right. I know. It's just it's funny to me because I feel like no one reads things in context. It's always just go to this verse, ignore, like, you'll never hear anything out of Proverbs. I think okay, you'll hear Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 for this is the beginning of wisdom, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But you only read verses 5 and 6, and then we don't see anything else really in Proverbs until we get to 8. And then there's, some things that God hates and something he loves, blah, blah, blah. But I just, I wanted to have someone with your status. You are a doctor, you have a PhD in biblical studies, and you are saying it's a good idea for someone to read a book from front to cover, not cherry pick random spots.
Yeah. I don't think
I agree with that.
110%.
That. Thank you. Yeah. I feel like sometimes people need to hear that, So now you mentioned a little bit of Baruch and Sirach. To a lot of my Protestant friends watching this, these are Apocrypha books and stuff like that. Is there anywhere else, or can you also expound upon Baruch and Sirach? Like, I know specifically Sirach 24, specifically verses 3 through 9. And when I was reading your book, I was very happy because you brought up things that I don't spend too much time in the Apocrypha, right? So I learned a lot from you, from what you brought up concerning Baruch and Sirach. Can you bring up some of those and any other points regarding the Deuterocanon or the Apocrypha.
Yeah, and this was a really difficult needle to thread because I know that most of my readers are going to be Protestants that only accept the 66 book canon. And again, I'm not suggesting that you need to have these additional books and add them to your canon. If you're a Catholic or Eastern Orthodox and you already have the 80 book canon, that's fine. It just makes it a whole lot easier for you to look a lot of these up. But what I'm trying to demonstrate is that these books were impacted by the books in the Hebrew Bible, Proverbs, Job, Psalm 104, and that they also impacted the early Christians. The early Christians were not just reading the Old Testament, okay? They were also reading these books that we call the intertestamental books, and they were being influenced by other things that might not actually, have actually been accessible, or the early Christians were reading them, something like the Dead Sea Scrolls, or Philo, or First Enoch, or, the Jewish ways of kind of understanding things that got solidified in the Targums. They're a little bit more difficult to date. So it's just kind of how do we hold all of this information and the tension together? And it's difficult to do because there's a lot of it. And a lot of the literature is not literature that many people are familiar with. Maybe you've never heard of some of these things right here. So in chapter 2 of the book, I think it's probably one of the most important chapters, is that I show what I think is the pilgrimage of wisdom, where it starts in Job, Psalms, Proverbs, and then it works its way through all of this intertestamental literature. And then by the end of it, I say, okay, by the time we get to the New Testament, what are the sort of things that Jews are saying about this personified attribute of God's wise interaction with and instruction to his creation? God's wisdom, personified wisdom, lady wisdom, woman wisdom. What can we say? And I kind of, find 9 points, and I say, okay, point number 1, you can see that in Job, Proverbs, Sirach, whatever. So in each of these books, again, they kind of do their own thing with it because they are drawing on primarily Proverbs, but also Job and Psalms in order to make the argument that their own book is trying to make. So Baruch in particular, Baruch is, of course, people know as Jeremiah's scribe. Probably wasn't really written by Jeremiah's scribe. It's a pseudonymous book. And so it's asking the question, why did the Babylonian exile happen? That was a question a lot of the Jews were asking at the time. Why did this happen? There's a lot of people nowadays that are like, why did a particular political party do extremely poorly in the election? A lot of people are kind of looking inward and asking that sort of question. And there's a lot of answers that the people are giving. So for the Babylonian exile that happened in 587, a lot of Jews were asking that sort of question. And so the writer Baruch says, well, the reason is because they rejected God's wisdom. They should have accepted God's wisdom, and wisdom is this fountain of life, and you should seek after her, you should look for her. And then eventually it says in chapter 4, verses 1 through 2 of Baruch, I can't believe I even remember that, that if you want it, you need to find it in the book of the law. Okay, that's where wisdom can now be found. Okay, so you should seek after it, you should look for it, but here actually is where you're going to find it. Okay, and again, you would already get that impression by reading the book of Proverbs, but Baruch is making that fairly explicit. So Sirach is doing a variety of things. Sirach is very much paralleled on the book of Proverbs, where it's going to begin by talking about wisdom as this personification, wisdom speaking in the first person, saying, I was there in heaven, and I came to earth, and I was looking for a place to dwell. I was looking for a place to tabernacle, and she found her place among Jacob, among Israel. And then later in the book, we learn that she actually becomes embodied in a high priest called Simon the High Priest, who was a historical high priest at the beginning of the 2nd century BC. So it's not a hypothetical person. It's a real person in history. So we have a male figure, the first male figure. And earlier in Sirach, we have 8 attributes that were formerly used to describe God's wisdom that are now being used with the very same Greek words to describe this historical high priest. The whole point there is to say, in this priest, we can now find the incarnation or the embodiment of God's personified wisdom. Not that Simon the high priest pre-existed his birth as God's wisdom, but that he is the embodiment of all of God's wise interaction, and they can now see that in the temple workings that he is performing in his priestly duties. So that's kind of a brief summary, but again, all the details and going through each of the verses, I go through in a lot more detail, and again in chapter 2 of the book.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Now, I wanted to ask about this specifically. So, considering like non-canonical books, right? And for everyone listening, when I say non-canonical, I'm talking about, yes, Enoch. Enoch is not a part of the Apocrypha. We need to stop that lie. But even like the book of like Adam and Eve or Jasher or Jubilees, even like New Testament canonical books like Third Corinthians, Clement's writings, the Didache. Is there anything in any of those books that talk about wisdom being personified, or using it in any type of way, or any type of Christology?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things is that it's very clear that First Enoch, particularly like chapters 42, 48, and 49, that sort of understanding of God's wisdom seems to have made an impact on the writer of the Gospel of John. I don't think it made an impact on Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I don't think they had access to that, or at least they don't demonstrate that they've had awareness of it. But this is kind of what's going on here. And by the way, if people want those things, let me see if I can actually point to it. Yeah, so over here, there are 3 volumes called the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha, and there's actually a 4th one that's actually going to be released in a couple of months. Okay, so that the technical collection is OTP, Old Testament Pseudepigrapha. So that's where you would get this information. I think First Enoch is actually in the first of the 3 volumes, but there's a 4th one coming. It's on my Amazon wish list, but it's like $80 right now. Anyway, so I don't know if you actually want to put up the text of First Enoch 42. It is something you could do, but until you do that, I'll try to talk about as much as I can remember off the top of my head. So in First Enoch chapter 42, the first 3 verses, it talks about how God's wisdom was looking for a place to dwell. She was looking for a place among humankind, but she couldn't find it, and so she's a rejected figure, so she returned to heaven. And so what we're starting to see here, again, is this impact of wisdom from the book of Proverbs, where Proverbs is looking for people to accept her. You can see this in Proverbs chapter 1, where wisdom is personified as a prophetess, okay? And she is basically saying, like, you need to listen to me, you need to listen to my words, but if you're going to spurn me, if you're not going to listen to me, then you're not going to be able to find me. I'm going to be inaccessible. In fact, there's this really interesting line in Proverbs chapter 1, where personified wisdom says, you will seek me and you will not find me. Where I'm going, you cannot come. And Jesus quotes that exactly in the Gospel of John, in John chapter 6. And even the people respond. They're like, what do you mean? You're going to seek me, but you're not going to find me. Where you're going, you cannot come. I mean, Jesus is literally quoting and speaking the very words of wisdom there from Proverbs chapter 1. So there's this sense in not only Proverbs, we also saw it in Job 28, to where wisdom is sometimes difficult to find, sometimes it's inaccessible. But the reason why First Enoch 42 is saying that wisdom is inaccessible is because Israel has rejected her. Okay. And of course, that's kind of the way that Baruch has kind of portrayed it. You know, why are you in exile? Because you've rejected God's wisdom. But if you want it, this is where you go and you get it. Okay. To where Sirach actually says, well, wisdom did find a place. And so there's there's differing traditions within the Jewish writings. Like, is wisdom accessible? Is she inaccessible? It just kind of depends on where Israel is in their history. And of course, there are times in Israel's history where Israel did listen to Yahweh fairly well. And there are times, as we all know, that wisdom was not listened to, or the people did not listen to God's instructions. So basically, you have that there in First Enoch 42, the first 3 verses. Now, in chapter 48 and 49, you actually have wisdom being described in terms of water as like this fountain, to where, she's kind of like the fountain that you would go drink of, that you would be nourished by. And then you also have a figure called Son of Man, which is very, very interesting. Okay. Son of Man later in First Enoch is described explicitly as Enoch himself, but the Son of Man is the one that is actually empowered by God's wisdom. And so you put all that together, what you actually see is that wisdom is a rejected figure. Wisdom tried to come down to earth, but wisdom was rejected. But if you really want wisdom, you have to go and you have to find this Son of Man figure who has been empowered with God's wisdom. And that sort of language is very much there in the Gospel of John. In the prologue, you have, the Logos, which is a synonym for God's wisdom. So everything you see about the Logos has a parallel with God's wisdom in the Jewish literature. So the Logos was in the world, but the world didn't recognize him. And this is Logos being personified, just like wisdom is personified. So the Logos came to his own, but his own did not receive him. So you have this rejected aspect right there. And of course, that's been impacted by this rejected wisdom motif that's in Judaism. And then, of course, Jesus is the Son of Man that's been empowered by God's wisdom that we need to seek after. And, that's why we have some of these passages in the Gospel of John about no one's ever ascended into heaven except for the Son of Man who descended from heaven. Well, the Son of Man is the one that brings God's wisdom down because Israel has rejected wisdom for so long. So there's a lot of these little tiny details that are there with First Enoch that I think makes it really interesting for shedding light on some of the language that's very distinctive to the fourth gospel that we don't actually have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
All right. Now, speaking of the Gospels, though, why is John's Gospel more heavily influenced by Christology over the other synoptic Gospels?
Yeah, I imagine you mean why is it more influenced by wisdom Christology?
Yes.
And I think we have to kind of look at, why is this gospel written? Why is the gospel written? It tells us in its own purpose statement in John 20, verse 31, that these things are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you will have life in his name. And so when we see the sort of ways in which that Jesus is talking to the Jews, it's not that the Jews are saying that Jesus never existed. What they're saying is that they don't believe that he really is the Messiah. They don't really think that he is the one that has been sent by God. So one of the primary ways in which Jesus is portrayed in the Gospel of John is that God has sent Jesus, or Jesus the one who has been sent by God. And that makes Jesus the agent. Okay, if you are sent by God, then you are one of God's agents. And so I think at least 40 times in the Gospel of John, more than any other of the Gospel writers, Jesus portrayed as God's agent. He's been sent by God, okay? And of course, if Jesus has been sent by God, then God really sent him, and you have to listen to what Jesus says. And if he claims to be the Messiah and you reject that, you're not just rejecting the Messiah, you're also rejecting God as well. Okay, so we have this sense in which the Gospel of John is trying to persuade the Jews that he really is the Jewish Messiah, and that you need to accept him, and you accept the early Christian claims about him. And there's some interesting flavors dealing with the situation in the Gospel of John and kind of what was going on with the Christians in Ephesus towards the end of the first century. That's another conversation we can have if we wanted to. But in order to portray Jesus as God's Messiah, the writer wants to draw on a lot of this wisdom literature in order to portray Jesus in this very particular light. Now, I don't think it's something that John is doing that's very unique to him, because we can already see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus just explicitly saying, that he is the wisdom of God. And he'll say that quite clearly from some of our earliest period. But it's very, very heavy in the Gospel of John. And I think the reason for this is that the Gospel of John wants to say that the words that Jesus speaks, they're not his own words. They're the words of God, because Jesus is God's agent. He speaks the words of God. They're not his own words. They're the words of Yahweh. And so if you reject Jesus' words, you're ultimately rejecting God. Okay? So this makes Jesus the mouthpiece of God. Now, the best way to portray and illustrate Jesus as an agent that is speaking the life-giving words of God is to use word imagery, not wisdom imagery. But in that time period, word and wisdom, as in Sophia and Logos, or Chokmah and Devar in Hebrew, they were effective synonyms. Okay, things that were said about God's word were already understood as being comparable to God's wisdom. Even in Proverbs, personified wisdom says, you need to listen to my words, the words that come out of my mouth. So words come from wisdom. The words of wisdom are wise words already. That's already there in the Old Testament. So also there, a good passage is Wisdom Solomon chapter 9, verses 1-2, where it says, "O God of our fathers, you made all things with your word, and you made all things with your wisdom," like in the same sentence. Like you made it with word and wisdom. That's just there. So I think for the writer of the Gospel of John, already having been influenced by wisdom Christology, he felt that the most effective way to convince the readers that Jesus really is the Messiah and that Jesus really is God's agent and that Jesus really is speaking the words of God, that word and logos, this masculine noun, was a much more effective tool for doing that than by using the feminine Sophia. I know it's kind of a long answer to the question, but I think it's really important for understanding the purpose and kind of the backbone of the Gospel of John.
No, that's awesome. So my next question is, I know a lot of people will, equivocate, part of the Trinitarian theology that Jesus is God because he acts as God's mouthpiece and he acts as the wisdom. Now, us as human beings, Old Testament and New Testament, even nowadays, us just mere mortals, can we also reflect wisdom, like represent those traits?
Yeah, I think you can, and I think that it was intended that you would do that. So the easiest passage to point out is Proverbs chapter 31, and I think there's two sections in Proverbs 31. Proverbs 31, 10 through 31 is the passage about the virtuous woman. It often gets preached at Mother's Day sermons. They don't do the Christology part the way they should, but it's basically the part of Proverbs that's not directed towards men. It's actually directed towards women. And so what it does, and the only way you're going to see this is by actually reading the Hebrew of Proverbs. That's, by the way, that was one of the reasons why I caught onto this, is because I was translating the Hebrew of Proverbs, and I got to Proverbs 31. I was like, look at all these things that are being said about this virtuous woman, and some of them are the very same Hebrew phrases that were used earlier in Proverbs 1 through 9, talking about God's wisdom. And I would go back and look and I would say, yeah, that's not an accident. That's intentional. Like,
Right.
Proverbs 31 is taking the attributes, like the very same things that are said about God's wisdom, that are not just haphazard and just mundane. They're kind of rare things. Like you're more valuable than gold and silver. Those sort of things that are kind of unique to wisdom. And now they're saying it in regard to these women. And it's like, okay, I see what's going on here. These women are those that have adopted wisdom into their life, and they've embodied these teachings. And now they're living and acting in wise ways, in ways that would actually attract the right men to them. Okay, so that's the whole purpose of it. It's not just, hey, to act this way, because the particular ways in which they're supposed to act are drawing on something like 11 or 12 of the things that were formerly said about God's wisdom in very real ways. It might not be easy to see in English, but it's definitely there in Hebrew. And when I thought, oh, wow, this is really, really cool, then I went and checked out the commentaries. I'm like, oh, like everybody's known about this for a long time. Like I thought, oh, I came up with something. I was like, oh, all these smart people have been saying this for a long time, which really helped me. It helped me to reinforce that, hey, I'm on the right track with this. Okay. So, that's been around for 2,500 years. Proverbs 31 was probably written around like 500 BC. So that's already there. But it's very, very clear that the teachings of Jesus, Jesus is saying things like that he's speaking the words of God. He's speaking God's wisdom, and that, you need to come to him, those who are weary and heavy laden, and I'm going to give you rest. Take my yoke upon me. It's light, and you're going to find rest for your souls. Those are like the last three verses in Matthew chapter 11, quoting directly out of Sirach chapter 51, where wisdom is saying all those things, or it's being said about wisdom. So, commentators have kind of put that together as well. So it's very clear that the teachings of Jesus are intended to be wise teachings that are empowered by God's wisdom. But even just kind of casually, let me actually pull up something here. So like in Colossians, Colossians has this really interesting hymn, Colossians 1:15 through 20, that has something like 8 or 9 parallels with Jewish literature talking about God's wisdom, because it's basically saying, like, line after line after line, things about Jesus that were already being said about God's wisdom. It's a Wisdom Christology poem or hymn. That also is the consensus of Colossians commentaries, by the way. But there in Colossians, like kind of scaffolding around this passage, are several passages that indicate that wisdom is something that you're supposed to embody in your own life in a way that's connected to Jesus in some really meaningful way. So let me, excuse me, I'll put on my glasses here. Let's see. I'm doing all this without a Bible, so. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to read 4 passages in particular. Okay. So Colossians 1:9, for this reason also, since the day we heard of it, we have not ceased to pray for you and ask that you be filled with the knowledge of his will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding. Okay. So they're to be filled with the knowledge of the will of God. But how do they do this? By being filled with God's wisdom. Okay. Colossians 1:28, we proclaim him, that's Christ, we proclaim Christ, admonishing every man and teaching every man with all wisdom, so that we can present every person complete in Christ. So we admonish people and we teach them with God's wisdom so that you can be complete in Christ. Notice the connection between wisdom and Christ. Here's another one, chapter 2, verse 3, talks about Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. I mean, Jesus bears the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. He's the embodiment of God's wisdom, quite casually there. Okay. And then chapter 3, verse 16, let the word of Christ, that's the gospel of Jesus preached, let Christ's gospel dwell within you with all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another. So to let Jesus' gospel dwell in you is to be done in the same breath with all wisdom. I mean, it's just, again, when even at the end in Colossians chapter 4, it's only 4 chapters long, he talks about being a good evangelist and going around and preaching the gospel of Jesus. And in the midst of that, he can say in chapter 4, verse 5, conduct yourself with wisdom towards outsiders. Well, you do that when you're preaching the gospel, because when you preach about Jesus, you have to conduct yourself with that wisdom. So you see, it's so ingrained in early Christianity that he could just so casually talk about this. But if we're unfamiliar with it, then we just miss over it, I think.
Right.
So I'm getting excited here. This is fun stuff.
No, I love this, seriously. So regarding kind of going back to John chapter 1, specifically verses 1 through 18, we see the language of, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, the Word became flesh, the Word dwelt among us, it was this light. We see this this Christology, which ultimately goes back to wisdom Christology. Where do we see? Or let me ask you this: do we see John chapter 1 verse 1 to 18 in the Tanakh?
Yes, we do. So in chapter 3 of my book, that's completely dedicated to the prologue. And what I do is I just kind of go line by line and I show how the things that are being said about God's wisdom have parallels in Judaism for things that were already being said about God's wisdom. Okay. And so it's as if this word, which we've already made the point that word and wisdom were effectively synonyms, personified word and personified wisdom were basically meaning the same thing. The things that are being said about the prologue were already being said about God's wisdom. And many of those parallels are there in the Hebrew Bible. So, of course, in the beginning was the word. Well, you have in the beginning was God's wisdom. That's there in Proverbs chapter 8. We even have some of the same Greek words in the Septuagint of Proverbs chapter 8. Wisdom was with God. The word was with God. That's also there in Proverbs chapter 8. All things were made through God's word. Well, I've already indicated Psalm 104, verse 24, where Yahweh made all things through his wisdom. Proverbs 3:19, Yahweh made all things through his wisdom. But you also have the word parallels too. Psalm 33:6, by the word of Yahweh, the heavens were made. And then you have obviously Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, which is kind of the major starting point for at least the first 5 verses of the prologue, to where God spoke, God said with his creative and powerful utterance, let there be light, and there was light. So, that much is already there in the Old Testament. I think the interesting thing that I try to point out, and this is in chapter 2 about Proverbs, is that you have personified wisdom in Proverbs chapters 1 through 9, but then you get to Proverbs 31, and you have these women who are the incarnation of personified wisdom. And the commentaries will use incarnation language. It's not a dirty word. It's not a word that means, a conscious pre-existing person becoming a man, or in the case of Proverbs 31, becoming a woman. It's just that this attribute of God becomes embodied into actual human beings. It's just the incarnate, the enfleshment of whatever this thing is. But the first occurrence of incarnational theology is there in the Old Testament. It's there in Proverbs 31. It's not Greek. It's not pagan. It's thoroughly Jewish. It's right there in the Hebrew, and it influenced the early Christians and Jesus' understanding of himself and how Paul wrote about him, and Philo and the Dead Sea Scrolls and the intertestamental writers, especially Sirach. So there's lots of parallels to the prologue, John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18, to the Tanakh. But it's not only there. There's also parallels in the intertestamental literature and the other pieces of literature that I demonstrate in chapter 2. That's why I don't even start with the Gospel of John in chapter 3 until I set the context in chapter 2 with that literature that shows how wisdom has kind of moved from the starting point all the way up to even a little bit after the first century.
No, yeah, your book, how you structured it is right on point. It's awesome. Now, I know we talked a little bit about targums. For anyone listening and doesn't know what targum means, targum just means translation. It is the Aramaic Old Testament, just for putting it in simplest terms, right? But I thought it's also important to know too that it's not a translation like how we have the Septuagint or the Masoretic. It's kind of here. Actually, I'll ask you, Dr. Dustin Smith, how would you say the targums are put together? It's not a translation per se.
Yeah. So obviously the Hebrew Bible is written in Hebrew, but in the first century, Hebrew was not the most common language in Palestine. Aramaic was. So very few people could read Hebrew. And so you need to be able to have the Bible, or at least its own interpretation, in a language that people could understand. And so there you have the targums that are there to kind of serve to bridge that particular gap. And of course, you'll have the Midrashim that also do the same thing as well. So it just comes down to the fact that most Jews living in the Holy Land during the first century knew Aramaic, and they didn't know Hebrew. Very few people knew Hebrew at that time period, but they were all speaking Aramaic, and so that's why it was in that particular language. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been needed. But it's interesting because whenever you translate something, you kind of give an interpretation of it, and so that's what makes the Targums very, very interesting. I'm slowly collecting critical editions of the Targums. They're very expensive. They're like $80 a piece, but I think I have about 10 of them right now. There are these, actually right above my head, there are these black books. So I'm trying to do the best that I can as a biblical scholar to keep myself well informed on these, I think, very important topics for understanding New Testament passages.
Yeah, definitely the Targums are definitely up there. That's why I have a digital one of Targum Neofiti with the Bereshith or Genesis. Now, my next question is this. Now, a lot of people will refer to Genesis Targum Neofiti concerning Genesis 1:1, where it says it reads a lot different than the Septuagint and the Masoretic. It says something along the lines, and I'm paraphrasing, in the beginning with the wisdom, the memra of the Lord, yada, yada, yada. Yeah. And we read throughout the rest of it, of Genesis chapter 1, and it's the memra of the Lord created, the memra of the Lord did this, did that. So it almost takes the credit away from the Lord, or like Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh in this instance, and gives it to this memra. So my question to you then is, how did the Jews understand this, and how should believers in Christ today properly understand it?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and I think it actually bears a lot on how you're supposed to read John chapter 1. So let's just kind of make sure that we're clear on these things, okay? So memra is just the Aramaic word for word. Okay, so memra just means word in Aramaic. We could just say devar if we wanted to. But what's interesting there, the way you quoted it, is that the Targum Neofiti of Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning with wisdom, the word made all these things. So notice even right there, wisdom and word are connected, already there by the Jews. Okay, but wisdom there is not a conscious pre-existing female person. And God's word there, of course, is just another way of saying this is how God is going to interact with things through this personified intermediary. Okay, but word is not a conscious talking male person in the Targums as well. It's just that God speaks to the word, which is very much already there in Genesis chapter 1, and God said, and God said, and God said. So here's the logic of this whole thing. So in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in Hebrew, it says, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ba'et haaretz. Okay, so Bereshit, in the beginning, that Reshit there is just this word for beginning. Now, there are many Jews that saw that discussion there at the beginning, and they connected it to also the word Reshit, beginning, in Proverbs chapter 8, verse 22, which says that Yahweh, this is personified wisdom speaking in the first person, Yahweh possessed me at the beginning, Reshit, of his way, before his works of old. And so what the Jews did, and this is really, really, really important, is that Jews connected Genesis chapter 1 and Proverbs chapter 8. Okay. And I actually think, and I'm not the only person that says this, Daniel Borarin, who's a great Jewish scholar, also makes this point, that the prologue of John's gospel is an unpacking and a midrash of Genesis chapter 1 and Proverbs chapter 8. Okay. Because notice in Genesis chapter 1, God creates through his word. In Proverbs chapter 8, God creates through his wisdom. You see, they're both working together. And so the Jews would connect that phrase, the Reshit word, the word that just gets translated beginning, because it appears in the Hebrew of Genesis 1:1 and Proverbs chapter 8, verse 22. And they took that and the Jews ran with that. I mean, they ran with that, and it's there in the Targums. It's there in the Babylonian Talmud. It's there in a variety of places, not just in Targum Neophiti. It's also there in a variety of other Targums as well. The names escape me off the top of my head. I have all this documented, by the way, in chapter 2 of the book, and also the parallels I point out in chapter 3 as well. But that's the key thing, is the connecting of Genesis 1:1 and Proverbs chapter 8, verse 22, because of the common word there, that they said, okay, we've got this beginning word, we got God creating through one of his attributes, whether it's word or wisdom. We know as Jews that these things are effectively synonyms. And I think the Gospel of John is just kind of building off of that. It's demonstrating awareness and agreement with that interpretive way of reading these passages together.
Yeah, so I wasn't able to bring up Enoch, but I do have this in a digital form, just so everyone can see. But yes, from the beginning with wisdom, the memory of the Lord created and perfected the heavens and the earth. And even when we go to verse 3, and the memory of the Lord said, by the decree of his memory, verse 4, and it was manifested late in light, and the memory of the Lord, as it continues on. So, and it's interesting too, because yes, actually, and now it's my turn to point to my book collection, the Midrash Rabbah that I have right here. It's interesting. In the very beginning, it does focus on, it does the play of word of uman and aman, which, translates to craftsman, which they associate with Proverbs chapter 8. So the Midrash, but you were saying, they associate that as the Torah was the master craftsman, and it equivocates it to, just as you have a master architect and then you have a master builder, God is the architect. God thinks how the world should be, but then his Torah is the manifestation or the master workman that we see. And like you said, in Bereshit, beginning, the root word for Reshit, this also the Midrash Rabbah, the very first one, focuses in on that. And for anyone interested, you can go, instead of paying $800 some for this, you can go to Sefaria, and I believe Sefaria even has it, and they talk about that too. So
I think mine's only like 6 volumes. It's over here, but there's some very, very interesting things that are said. I've only read through it once, but a lot of underlining.
Oh yeah, so out of like all the Jewish writings, the Midrash, by far my favorite. I like the Talmud; it's interesting. The Midrash, or the Mishnah, interesting. Gemara is interesting. Some of the Zohar, interesting. But the Midrash, 10 out of 10 for me. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So so now going with that though, what are the differences and the similarities that we see between wisdom and the Logos / Memra?
Yeah, so the only major difference is that wisdom, both in its Hebrew form, Chokmah, and in Greek, Sophia, is grammatically feminine. and Devar is masculine. Although Memra, by the way, in Aramaic is feminine, which is kind of interesting. But in logos, of course, in Greek is masculine. Okay, so you got all these languages that you have to kind of keep balanced in your mind. And again, I'm assuming that most of your viewers probably have not taken these biblical languages, so I'm just doing the best that I can to explain these to people. So, and again, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that the figure of Jesus can be the embodiment of personified Lady Wisdom, because again, Simon the High Priest in Sirach, before any Christian was even born, or before Jesus was even born, he's already being portrayed in Jewish works as a male figure that is the embodiment of this personification of a feminine attribute. So there's nothing wrong with that. The early Christians are doing the same thing, but most of the other occurrences, like Proverbs chapter 31, it's women. In 1Q20, this passage from the Dead Sea Scrolls, Sarah, Abraham's wife, is very clearly the incarnation of God's wisdom. And then in Philo, he has 4 different successive wisdom: Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Zipporah, 4 successive women that are the embodiment of God's wisdom. So primarily it was women, and that just naturally makes sense. But it could be a male figure as well, as we see there in Sirach with Simon the High Priest, but also with Jesus as well. So I think that's kind of how they did it. But again, I think from the writer of the Gospel of John, if I'm understanding him correctly, he thinks that the best way to portray Jesus as the mouthpiece of God that speaks forth God's words, it's better to use logos as opposed to feminine Sophia. Because
Right.
it just obviously word more effectively conveys that imagery of the mouthpiece of God, which actually is drawing on Deuteronomy 18. The ways in which Deuteronomy 18 have made its impact on the Gospel of John have really been underappreciated. I think I did something like 7 podcast episodes, 7 weeks in a row, like tracing it. There's a lot in there for that. So the impact of Deuteronomy 18, to where Yahweh puts his word into the mouth of this prophet, and you have to listen to him. And if you don't do it, you're in big trouble. That's it's great. But that sort of Christology is very much there as well, which again indicates that Jesus is the authorized agent speaking forth the words of Yahweh himself.
Okay. Now kind of going with that, how can we understand wisdom and agency together? Like when you are an agent, like that's an agent, and he is here representing God's qualities, basically his own essence, but not literally being God, right?
Yeah.
So how do those two interact
Okay.
with wisdom and agency?
Can you pull up Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 9?
Wisdom of Solomon.
Yeah, intertestamental literature. Wisdom, Book of Wisdom. Let me make sure I got the right one here.
I see any apocryphal books. I don't.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I apologize.
That's okay. It's good. You're good. So here's the deal. So in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, we can see that God will send forth his personified attributes. He will personify them as his agents. Okay. So we can see in, I think it's like Psalm 107, where God sends forth his word. We don't talk this way. Okay. But it's also there in Isaiah 55, verse 11. I'm going to send forth my word on a mission. But it's just a way of saying that God is going to talk, and whatever he says, he's going to do. And, you could trust that he's going to do that. God also sends forth the Spirit. He sends forth his burning anger. God sends forth his attributes all the time. We don't see God sending wisdom per se. Like we don't see wisdom being the object of shalach, the verb to send, except for in Proverbs chapter 1, where wisdom is a prophetess, and all prophets or prophetesses are by nature sent. Okay, so that much is pretty much clear. But in this intertestamental book that has impacted the New Testament in a lot of ways, we have wisdom being sent. So in chapter 9, this Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 9, I would say anybody just go get an NRSV, get a used one off Amazon for $2, and it's going to have all these books or you can Google it. That's fine. So, so Solomon, air quotes here, is praying, and he says in chapter 9, verse 10, "Send her forth from the holy heavens and from the throne of your glory. Send her." Why? "So that she may labor at my side, and I may learn what is pleasing to you." So we could see that, he's praying. The wisest man in the world is praying for God to send forth wisdom, twice in one verse. And actually at the very, very end of the passage in, in verse 17, "Who has learned your counsel unless you have given wisdom and sent your Holy Spirit from on high?" So we can see God giving his wisdom and God sending his wisdom are set in parallel. This is what Solomon is praying for. And that's actually really interesting, because we actually have in the Gospel of John, in John chapter 3, 16 and 17, you can probably put that up, I'm sure. Why don't you put that up there? Because
John 16.
John 3:16 and 3:17. There are a lot of scholars that have actually said that this sort of language, again, these very familiar passages, John 3:16 and 3:17, have been influenced by this passage in Wisdom of Solomon, to where Solomon is saying, send wisdom, send the Spirit. God's going to give his wisdom in order that something important is actually going to take place, in order that people are going to find salvation. Versus the salvation passage. Verse 18, the last verse there in Wisdom chapter 9. It says that the people were saved by wisdom. So you have all these in Wisdom of Solomon, which predates the Gospel of John by maybe 200 years. You have God sending his wisdom, God giving his wisdom for the purpose of bringing salvation. What do we have in John 3:16? God loved the world in this way, that he gave his son, so that if you believe, you're not going to perish, but you're going to have everlasting life. Okay. God didn't send the son into the world, but in order that the world would be saved through him. So you have the very same language there. You have God sending wisdom in order that people could be saved. And God has given the wisdom. Notice that he gave his son in verse 16, and he sent the son in verse 17. Those are meant to be parallels. Well, that's also what's there. So lots of scholars and lots of commentaries will say this has been impacted by the portrayal of personified wisdom in Wisdom of Solomon, because the very same language is being used there. But again, you read over that and you don't see it if you're not familiar with this sort of literature. So I think that's fairly compelling, because it's the same words in Greek, even the purpose phrase, ina, the word in order that.
All right. Okay, so then I want to move in real quick to my last question before we go into our closing with this. With the parables of Matthew chapter 21 and Mark chapter 12, which is, the parable of the vineyard, where a guy plants a vineyard and he sends out his agents to go collect payment. All the payments, or all the agents, are killed. But then when Jesus is sent out, they say, "Oh, this is the heir, let's also kill." Both instances show that just as the prophets were agents in the Old Testament, Jesus is also sent out to act as an agent. Now, I wanted to ask you, does Yeshua's type of agency as being, wisdom, Christology, manifested in a sense, does that differ from theirs?
No, I don't think so, because if God is sending his wisdom, and that wisdom has become embodied in Jesus, whether that's at his birth or at his baptism, I don't think it matters so much. But I think people should be aware there's a debate as to kind of when the word or wisdom became flesh. But it's very clear that God has sent the wisdom in order to do that. And so it would mean that if Jesus is embodying God's word and God's wisdom, they are the words and wisdom that have been sent by God. And so he definitely sees himself as a prophetic figure. He calls himself a prophet. People recognize him as a prophet. He acts like a prophet. He does prophetic things. If it looks like a prophet, smells like a prophet, he probably is a prophet. Okay. Not to mention the deliberate parallels with Deuteronomy 18, which is the prophet like Moses. So the Wisdom Christology very much is impacted by the principle of agency. They go hand in hand. And actually, some of the scholars have actually said that's the best way to understand the Gospel of John is to understand agency and wisdom Christology. I think Thompson, first name escapes me at this point. She has a variety of books. She's a female scholar out of Fuller Seminary, written a bunch of books on the Gospel of John and Christology. And that was her point, is that the wisdom Christology has to be made sense through the agentival Christology. So that agent stuff is already there in the parable of the vineyard, which of course allows Jesus to fully represent God in every possible way. And the agent thing is very, very important in the Gospel of John, because Jesus is doing a whole lot of things that only God is supposed to do. God is the one that gives life, and God is the one that judges. Well, in John chapter 5, Jesus is like, I'm the one that's going to be able to give you life, and I'm the one that's going to be able to judge. But he very clearly says, I'm doing this because these prerogatives have been given to me, not because he innately possesses them. He carries out these divine prerogatives and roles precisely as God's agent.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And, I think that's just one of the biggest things too, because if people had a proper understanding of agency, and even I've talked to individuals where they'll say that they understand agency, but they'll still say, oh, well, Jesus does this thing. Jesus raised someone from the dead. Only God can raise someone from the dead. That means Jesus is literally God. And, just any of the actions done where the encyclopedia I always read it's actually next to me. This is the one that I'll use, the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Religion right here, where it literally says that you act as this person. You represent the principle. So any act done, like if Dustin, you send me out to go get a pizza, someone's going to say, are you Dustin? Yes, I'm here to pick it up for, I'm going to represent you. It's just people don't understand that. And it's Western versus Eastern culture. We just don't really have anything like that. Like the closest thing would be, power of attorney.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I use the pizza reference all the time. Because if I order Papa John's, which I don't do today because I eat really healthy. But if I order Papa John's and knock at the door and my wife says, who's there? And I can say, it's Papa John's. I open the door and it's a guy with the name tag says Steve. Okay. But we all know that Steve represents Papa John's.
Right.
Okay. He's delivering it on behalf of Papa John's. I can say Papa John's is here, even though the guy, Papa John, is not there. And I write the check out to Papa John's, not to Steve. And if I don't do that, then Papa John's is upset at me. But clearly he's functioning as the agent who has been sent to deliver something, and I'm supposed to respond appropriately to that agent. So that's since you brought up the pizza analogy, I thought let me share this one with you. I people get a good kick out of that.
Yeah, it's this. So I see. I always say Domino's, but Papa John's, same thing.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Dustin Smith, thank you so much for coming on. Final question, to whoever gets this book and whoever reads it, what do you want your readers to basically leave with after they've read this book?
Yeah. Two things in particular. One is a much greater appreciation of the portrayal of Jesus in the Gospel of John that has been definitively impacted and shaped by Jewish portrayals of personified wisdom. That's really important because, again, I think that a strong case can be made, and I made that case, that you can find it in all 21 chapters, not just in the prologue. Some people might say, yeah, I get it with the prologue, but they won't see it in the other ones. But I think there's a lot of evidence there for it being in all 21 chapters. And the second thing is a recognition that if Jesus is the embodiment of wisdom, the wisdom that was in the beginning with God and the wisdom that became flesh, and that wisdom in Second Temple Judaism, and particularly in the Old Testament, is a personification, then to talk about the preexistence of Jesus, we have to talk about the preexistence of personification. So yeah, I will say that Jesus preexists, and he preexists as wisdom, but wisdom is a personification, not a conscious person. So it's not a conscious preexistence. And so it's not that, does Jesus preexist or does he not preexist? The question is, what sort of preexistence are we talking about? Because preexistence wasn't a monolithic thing, even in Judaism. they could talk about something that actually existed or something that pre-existed in God's plans and purposes. And it's interesting, when they talk about the name of the Messiah, they would put that in the pre-existence of God's name, plans and purposes category, not in the actually existing thing. So those are the two things that I would want people to walk away with from the book. And if anyone is going to read it and they want to reach out to me and they want to have a conversation, I'm happy to talk to you. If you're going to take the time to interact with my work, I'm going to take the time to listen to you, respond to your emails. I'll call you on the phone. Let's talk. Let's work this out here. And I'm happy to talk about that and to hear your impressions on things, or give me the opportunity to clarify something that might have been confusing. So I'm just grateful that people are interacting with my work. So if you do that, thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
No, yeah. So again, guys, this is Wisdom Christology right here. And I'm going to pull up the Amazon so you guys can, again, just see it, just to really, really emphasize on this book, guys. Because again, like I already said, one of my little spiel is there's a lot of books that just aren't good, right? So me personally, if I find a treasure, I want everyone else to know about this treasure. And Wisdom Christology in the Gospel of John by Dr. Dustin Smith is exactly that treasure. Please, Christmas and Hanukkah is coming up. Okay, whatever you celebrate or don't celebrate, just celebrate it this year. Put this on your list. Write to Santa Claus, or write to, I don't know. We don't have anything for Hanukkah. I don't know. Just write to Judah Maccabee what you want. Send it out in a letter. Definitely. I mean, this. Seriously, if you really want to get a good understanding, especially the writing, how John is with Wisdom Christology, you want to understand attributes of God better, you want to understand Jesus better, this is the book for you. If you just want to say you believe in Jesus and he came and died for your sins, and you just want to kind of go to church and go in, go out, and you're not interested, this isn't for you. But for the people who are serious about studying, who want to have a relationship with God, a closer understanding of who his son is, this is for you. You need to get this book. And this is my opinion. Dr. Dustin Smith is not paying me to say this. We are in two different places, so he's not holding a gun to my head to say this. I reached out to him, asking him if he can come on my channel to talk about this, because this is such an amazing, amazing book. So, Dr. Dustin Smith, thank you for coming on. Thank you for writing this book for all of us to be more on your level of understanding of the Wisdom Christology that we read throughout the Bible, and especially in John. Seriously, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So, all right. Well, with that being said, I'll see you guys on the next one, and shalom.